Welcome, friends, to another edition of the Economic Current, where we look beneath the headlines, behind the press releases, and straight into the uneasy marriage between money and power. I'm your host, Richard Wolff, or as my students like to joke, the guy who still insists that economics is about people, not slogans. Before we begin today's analysis, a few quick notes. Our upcoming lecture, The Price of Alliance Europe between Washington and Moscow, will take place next Thursday at the London School of Economics. And for those who've been asking, yes, our new report, Subsidies and Sanctions, the Real Global Supply Chain, will be released later this month, free to download on our website. Finally, a reminder, your support keeps independent analysis alive. No corporate sponsors, no political strings, just public economics for the public good. Now to the story of the week, one that at first glance seems almost like a paradox. The United States is withdrawing troops from Eastern Europe, trimming its military presence in Romania, Poland, and the Baltic states, even as it tells the European Union to buy more American products, from liquefied natural gas to defense equipment and even commercial aircraft. In other words, Washington is reducing its security footprint while expanding its economic expectations, two currents moving in opposite directions. And yet we're told they flow toward the same goal, shared prosperity and stability. That, friends, is what we'll examine today. Let's begin with the facts. Reports this week from Brussels confirm that the Pentagon has quietly approved a rotation reduction. One armored brigade and two aviation units will not return to Eastern Europe next spring. At almost the same time, U.S. trade envoys have renewed pressure on the EU to ease restrictions on American agricultural imports, increase purchases of LNG, and delay new digital taxation on U.S. tech giants. It's an odd choreography. One hand withdraws soldiers, the other hand extends invoices. And European officials are left wondering which message is the real one. Is America stepping back or leaning in harder than ever, only this time through the market rather than the military? To ordinary citizens, it sounds confusing. To economists, it looks strategic. This is what I call the trade security swap, when a global power converts defense leverage into commercial opportunity. In the Cold War, the United States stationed troops to guarantee markets. In the new era, it withdraws troops and uses markets to justify its leadership. Different instruments, same purpose, maintain dependence. But dependence has a cost. Consider the case of Constanța, a port city on Romania's Black Sea coast. The mayor there, in our fictional vignette, receives two unsettling pieces of news in the same week. First, the U.S. brigade stationed nearby will be redeployed within months. Second, the price of steel needed to rebuild the city's main bridge has risen 18% due to transatlantic tariffs and supply chain turbulence. One phone call from Washington tells him to stay calm. Another from his construction supplier in Germany tells him the steel will cost more because America wants it that way. He doesn't know whether to worry about security or inflation. In truth, he should worry about both, because the two are now entwined. When a superpower uses defense policy as leverage in trade, it risks turning allies into clients. And when clients begin to question the deal, faith in the alliance begins to erode. Before jumping deeper into the economics, let's pause on the symbolism. Troop withdrawal is not just a military maneuver. It's a signal, a test of loyalty. It says to Europe, we're not abandoning you, but we expect you to prove you can stand on your own by buying more from us. That's not partnership. That's conditional friendship. It shows that what used to be a security pact is becoming a commercial arrangement wrapped in patriotic language. In a sense, NATO has always been a hybrid, part shield, part marketplace. But today, that balance tilts more clearly toward commerce, defense contractors, LNG exporters, and agribusiness firms see the vacuum of troops not as a loss, but as a new sales pitch. If we can't protect you with boots, we'll protect you with barrels. This shift might seem pragmatic, even efficient, but efficiency is not the same as trust. When the arithmetic of alliance replaces its ethics, something essential is lost. Europe senses it, and that's why, behind closed doors, officials in Berlin and Paris are quietly asking, how much American security do we really need, and at what cost to our sovereignty? That's where our story begins, in that quiet doubt spreading through ministries, boardrooms, and even small towns like Constanza, because when the world's strongest ally acts like a creditor instead of a partner, every policy looks less like protection and more like a transaction. Let's move to the deeper question. Why would Washington choose this moment to pull troops back from Europe only to push trade demands harder? On the surface, it looks contradictory, but in economic terms, it's the same instrument played in a different key. To understand that, we must recall how post-war U.S. power has always operated through two intertwined systems, security and trade. During the Cold War, these systems reinforced one another. The U.S. guaranteed Europe's defense against the Soviet Union, and in return, Europe opened its markets to American goods, technology, and investment. The dollar, the military base, and the shipping contract were three parts of one machine. Today, that machine is showing wear. The security rationale has weakened. Russia, while still aggressive, is no longer an existential threat to Western Europe. Meanwhile, Europe's trade with Asia, particularly China, has surged. So the logic inside Washington shifts. If defense no longer buys loyalty, perhaps markets will. In plain English, the United States is trying to monetize its military presence. When a soldier leaves, a salesman arrives. When a base closes, a trade mission opens, and when allies complain of exposure, they're offered the next best thing: energy deals, weapons contracts, and digital infrastructure partnerships. Don't be fooled by the language of efficiency. This isn't cost cutting, it's cost shifting. Instead of spending American tax dollars to maintain troops abroad, Washington expects European taxpayers to buy more American goods, thereby financing U.S. industry while sustaining the alliance's economic core. It's the old empire model, but privatized. Let's take one example. Energy. Over the past 2 years, U.S. liquefied natural gas exports to Europe have more than doubled. American officials frame this as energy diversification, a polite way of saying buy less from Russia, buy more from us. But behind the rhetoric lies a political calculation. As troop presence declines, energy dependency rises. A tank may defend a border, but a gas contract binds a continent. This dynamic extends beyond fuel. In 2024, Washington pushed the EU to purchase more American defense equipment under the pretext of interoperability. The same year, it also pressured Brussels to delay carbon border taxes that might have penalized U.S. exports. Each time, the message was identical. Your security depends on our cooperation, and our cooperation depends on your market access. Economically, it's ingenious. Politically, it's brittle, because every transaction reopens the question of trust. When security and trade are so tightly fused, every tariff feels like a threat, every troop movement like a bargaining chip. And Europeans, particularly in the East, are starting to see it that way. Let's return to our fictional Romanian mayor. His city has just learned that the American brigade will not be returning for the summer rotation. Local businesses, from steel suppliers to logistics firms, had grown around that presence. Construction companies won contracts from military infrastructure projects. Restaurants thrived on visiting personnel. Now that revenue evaporates, and in its place, a memorandum from the U.S. Commerce Department encouraging the region to invest in American energy infrastructure. To him, it feels like a trade, soldiers out, salesmen in. And while Washington insists that nothing has changed, on the ground, everything has. Now let's step back. In the 1,950 seconds, when Eisenhower warned against the military-industrial complex, he meant the domestic machinery of defense spending. Today, that machinery has gone global. The military withdraws physically, but remains economically embedded through contracts, procurement, and strategic dependence. The empire no longer builds fortresses, it builds supply chains. Here's the irony. The United States tells Europe to be more self-reliant, to increase its defense budgets, its energy resilience, its industrial capacity. Yet at the same time, it ensures that each of those efforts routes back through American corporations. The rhetoric of autonomy masks a new form of dependency, not enforced by troops, but by invoices. This is called burden sharing. It sounds cooperative, but in practice, it means the burden is shared, the profits are not. European taxpayers pay more for defense systems often built in America. They pay higher energy bills to replace Russian gas with American LNG. And in return, they get fewer soldiers on their soil and more speeches about partnership. By the way, this isn't unique to Europe. The same model operates in the Indo-Pacific, where Washington's security pivot coincides with a surge in U.S. arms and tech exports. The pattern is clear. Withdraw, then sell. So what happens when an ally realizes the transaction? History gives us a clue. In the 1,960 seconds, Charles de Gaulle pulled France out of NATO's military command precisely because he saw this imbalance, American control, disguised as cooperation. Today, echoes of that decision ripple again through Paris and Berlin. The question is not whether Europe can survive without U.S. troops. It's whether it can survive with this kind of economic dependency masquerading as freedom. Now let's look at what happens when policy contradictions become political fuel. Because the moment allies start to sense imbalance, the alliance itself begins to fracture, not in open rebellion, but in quiet resistance. And that's what's happening across Europe today. The same European leaders who a decade ago would have echoed Washington's every word are now learning to speak in two tones, cooperative in public, skeptical in private. The slogans remain: shared values, transatlantic unity, defending democracy. But behind those polished statements, another conversation unfolds, one about cost, autonomy, and trust. The contradiction is painfully clear. Washington tells Europe to prepare for an age of great power competition, yet it also removes part of the very military infrastructure meant to deter that competition. The troops that once anchored American credibility in the East are being rotated home. Meanwhile, Europe is told to take more responsibility for its own defense, meaning, of course, to buy more American-made jets, missiles, and digital systems. Don't be fooled by the polite phrasing. Strategic responsibility is the new euphemism for financial dependency. It's a shift from security through presence to security through purchase, and Europe's publics are noticing. Let's take Poland, where trust in the U.S. as a reliable defender dropped from 84% to 67% in the latest Eurobarometer survey. Or look at Germany, where coalition parties argue openly about whether buying F-35 jets really serves Europe's defense or merely subsidizes American industry. In Italy, populists on both left and right now describe NATO spending as an American tax. Even in pro-US countries like the Netherlands, public debates increasingly ask why European taxpayers fund U.S. contractors while their own infrastructure crumbles. In this climate, the U.S. withdrawal sends a message far louder than any diplomatic reassurance can fix. It tells Europeans that Washington's commitment is conditional, transactional, and above all, reversible. That's the spark for a new movement often labeled strategic autonomy. The term sounds technocratic, but what it really means is independence, the desire to have Europe's foreign, energy, and industrial policies shaped in Brussels, not in Washington. It's not anti-Americanism, it's the search for adulthood in a relationship long defined by paternalism. But here's the irony. Every time European leaders try to act more independently, say by negotiating gas deals with Qatar or creating a European defense fund, Washington reacts with unease. Autonomy is welcome in theory, threatening in practice. The alliance, it seems, loves European strength only when it follows American lines. That tension shows most clearly in energy policy. Europe is paying some of the highest electricity and gas prices in the world, partly because of its decision under U.S. pressure to replace cheap Russian pipelines with expensive American LNG shipments. The cost gap is not minor. In 2025, European consumers are expected to pay roughly 30% more for imported gas than pre-crisis levels, despite stabilization in global prices. American exporters, on the other hand, are enjoying record profits. So when European officials call for fairer terms, Washington frames it as disloyalty. When France proposes taxing tech giants to balance its budget, it's accused of protectionism. When Germany explores cooperation with China's EV industry, it's warned of geopolitical risk. The message is clear. Autonomy is acceptable only when it doesn't compete with American interests. Now, picture our Romanian mayor. Again, his city lies along the same corridor where NATO supply convoys used to pass. Today, those convoys are fewer. The town's income from base logistics has fallen. The mayor attends a meeting in Bucharest where ministers discuss compensating regions affected by troop withdrawals. The proposed solution? EU funds financed partly through new contributions from member states already burdened by defense spending targets. He listens, does the math, and sighs. The steel for his bridge costs more because of tariffs. The local budget is stretched by energy imports. And the security umbrella that once justified those expenses is thinning. He's not anti-American. He's simply realizing that the numbers no longer add up. And that's the core of Europe's dilemma. Loyalty is expensive, and the price keeps rising. Every time Washington changes its posture, from defense to trade, from presence to persuasion, Europe absorbs the shock in its budgets, industries, and households. Inflation in construction materials, high shipping costs, delayed energy projects, they all trace back in some way to the shifting winds of transatlantic policy. Let's not forget, the same governments now asking Europe to buy more are the ones that just a few years ago imposed tariffs on European steel and aluminum under the guise of national security. That wound never fully healed. Brussels remembers, Berlin remembers, and now When Washington speaks of shared burden, Europeans quietly recall who wrote the last invoice. We live in a system that preaches solidarity while practicing leverage. It's the illusion of equality inside a hierarchy of dependence. And the longer that contradiction persists, the more Europeans, from the mayor in Constanza to the policymakers in Brussels, begin to question whether partnership can survive without balance. Let's now move from geopolitics to the factory floor, where policies turn into paychecks and alliances turn into bills. Because what looks like a strategic adjustment in Washington often feels like an economic earthquake in Europe. Across the continent, the real effects of America's twin pressures, withdrawal of troops and expansion of trade demands, are becoming visible. They're not abstract. They're measured in the overtime hours of steel workers, the fuel surcharges on freight trucks, and the canceled investments in renewable projects that no longer make financial sense. Take the European defense sector. Since Washington began reducing its eastern deployments, Brussels has pushed member states to fill the gap by increasing their own defense spending. On paper, that sounds like European independence. In practice, however, much of that new spending flows directly to American suppliers, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing. The latest joint procurement framework lists U.S. systems for almost 70% of upcoming acquisitions. It's a paradox that would make even Orwell pause. Europe spends more to be more self-reliant, yet ends up more dependent. This is called strategic sovereignty in policy memos, but for the accountants who sign the checks, it's simply expensive outsourcing dressed in patriotic rhetoric. Meanwhile, the transport and energy industries, two sectors that form the backbone of Europe's competitiveness, are bearing the brunt of transatlantic frictions. The tariffs and energy shifts that Washington encourages in the name of security translate into higher costs at every stage of production. Let's unpack that. When U.S. LNG exports replace Russian pipeline gas, the price per unit rises roughly 20-30%. Not because of scarcity, but because of logistics. LNG must be liquefied, shipped, and regasified, all energy-intensive processes dominated by American and Qatari companies. European ports like Rotterdam and Gdańsk are investing billions in new terminals to handle this trade. That money could have modernized rail networks or funded clean energy storage instead. It's going into infrastructure built to sustain dependency. The transport sector is hit next. Trucking companies in Germany and France face rising diesel costs tied to those same energy imports. Airlines pass on higher fuel surcharges to passengers. Shipping firms along the Danube report a 15% increase in freight costs since last year. None of this is random. It's the downstream effect of an economic model where allies are treated less as partners and more as captive customers. And workers, they feel it first. Wage growth in manufacturing is stagnating even as work intensity rises. A recent Eurostat survey shows that 61% of small and medium-sized manufacturers now list energy and input costs as their number one business risk, up from 28% before the tariff and energy realignment began. In Romania, our fictional mayor from Constanza receives another report. The steel company contracted to build his bridge has delayed delivery again. Their reason? American tariffs on metal imports have disrupted the European steel market. Even after partial suspension, the uncertainty alone drives prices up. To stay afloat, the company cuts overtime pay and postpones hiring. The mayor reads the report, folds it quietly, and looks at the half-finished structure across the river, a monument to global politics. By the way, this is not just about one town. It's about the logic that binds economies together in asymmetrical ways. Washington claims the moral high ground of shared defense, but the economic mechanisms beneath that rhetoric look eerily like the old colonial trade routes. Value flows one way, dependency flows the other. Here's what that means. Europe's industrial policy, once designed to compete globally, now functions increasingly as a mechanism to absorb U.S. policy shocks. When Washington bans advanced chip exports to China, European semiconductor firms lose access to crucial markets. When the U.S. Congress passes an Inflation Reduction Act that subsidizes domestic green industries, European EV and battery producers suddenly find themselves at a disadvantage. And when Europeans protest, Washington's response is the same. You're free to do the same if you can afford it. Let's not forget, freedom without means is dependency by another name. Even European consumers, who rarely think in terms of global trade, can feel the shift. Electricity bills remain volatile. Public transport fares rise to offset higher energy contracts. Inflation in building materials, steel, copper, cement continues to outpace wages. Each statistic reads like a technical adjustment. Together, they tell a political story, the cost of loyalty. And yet, many policymakers still call this the price of freedom. It's a convenient phrase, but an empty one. Freedom for whom? For the corporations whose profit margins widen each time a sanction reshuffles trade routes? Or for the citizens who pay more each month just to maintain a sense of alignment with an ally that increasingly behaves like a creditor? The irony is stark. America once accused Europe of free riding on U.S. defense spending. Now, the situation has flipped. The U.S. free rides on Europe's market, extracting demand, jobs, and trust while reducing its own physical commitment. It's efficient, yes, but it's also exploitative. Before we move forward, let's step back in time, because these trade security contradictions are not new inventions. They are echoes of an older design, one refined over decades, repackaged for modern diplomacy. After World War II, the United States built not only Europe's reconstruction, but also its economic dependency. The Marshall Plan, often celebrated as the greatest act of generosity in modern history, was also a strategic architecture of control. Dollars rebuilt cities, yes, but they also rebuilt loyalty. European currencies were tied to the dollar, European militaries to NATO, and European trade routes to US-backed logistics. In that system, Washington didn't need colonies. It had clients. And then came the 1970 seconds, another turning point, when the U.S. abandoned the gold standard in 1971. Europe's monetary autonomy shrank overnight. The oil shocks followed, and once again, Europe's survival hinged on American energy diplomacy and the petrodollar system. Each crisis reinforced the same dependency. America shaped the rules, Europe paid the costs. Now fast forward half a century, the tools have changed: tariffs, digital taxes, LNG shipments instead of oil, but the structure remains familiar. What was once reconstruction aid is now energy diversification. What was once NATO burden sharing is now defense procurement alignment. The words are new, the power dynamics are not. This is how a hegemonic economy sustains itself without formal empire. Instead of occupying territory, it occupies policy space. Instead of governors, it sends trade envoys. Instead of tribute, it collects trade surpluses and corporate rents. And because it operates under the banner of shared values, few dare to call it what it is, economic domination with diplomatic manners. Let's connect this to our present case, the troop withdrawal paired with trade pressure. Historically, when a dominant power shifts from direct presence to economic leverage, it signals two things: cost fatigue and confidence in control. Washington believes that even without soldiers in Eastern Europe, its influence will hold because the economic ties are now strong enough to keep allies in orbit. But history also warns us. The moment an empire believes dependency equals stability, it begins to misread reality. In the 1960 seconds, the US thought it could manage both European loyalty and global expansion through the dollar system. By the late 1970 seconds, stagflation and trade imbalances cracked that illusion. In the early 2000s, America assumed its control over global finance would secure unquestioned dominance. Then came the 2008 crash, and with it, a loss of moral credibility. And today, as Washington merges trade pressure with selective military retreat, it risks repeating the same mistake, believing that markets can replace trust. Now, let's remember that alliances, like economies, depend on perception. What matters is not just what is done, but what it means. When European citizens see troops leave and bills rise, when they hear speeches about unity while paying double for steel, they don't think strategic efficiency. They think we're being used. This perception gap widens every time a new policy lands without explanation. When U.S. negotiators push Brussels to buy more LNG or delay environmental tariffs, they speak the language of partnership. But workers in Antwerp, Marseille, or Gdansk hear a different tune, one that sounds like coercion wrapped in friendship. Our Romanian mayor embodies that confusion. At the local cafe, residents debate what the troop withdrawal means. One says it's a sign of peace. Another says it's abandonment. A third points to the rising bridge costs and shrugs. Peace doesn't pay the bills. That's the human layer missing from grand strategy. The ordinary people, mayors, builders, transport workers, live in the shadow of decisions made thousands of miles away. For them, alliance politics isn't theory. It's the price of diesel, the cost of steel, the delay of salaries. We need to remember something here. Systems of control always begin as systems of cooperation. The Roman Republic called its client states friends. The British Empire called its colonies protectorates. The United States calls its partners allies. In each case, the language softened the hierarchy until the hierarchy became so visible it could no longer be denied. The European Union, for all its internal flaws, now stands at that threshold. It wants partnership, but it's realizing that dependence, military or economic, carries a moral weight. You can't claim sovereignty while outsourcing your security and importing your inflation. You can't preach unity while absorbing one-sided deals. By the way, this awareness is spreading beyond elites. Polling data from early 2025 shows a record 62% of Europeans now support developing an independent defense capability separate from the United States. That's not anti-American sentiment. It's the logical conclusion of decades of imbalance. Here's the lesson history teaches. Every dependency system reaches a breaking point when the costs exceed the benefits. The Marshall Plan once rebuilt Europe. Now the LNG plan threatens to hollow it out. What begins as protection ends as constraint. The U.S. may not realize it yet, but its greatest leverage, economic interdependence, is also its greatest vulnerability. Because once allies learn to question the bargain, the machinery of consent starts to stall. Let's now turn to something less visible, but no less powerful: the stories that sustain dependency. Because no empire, no alliance, and no policy endures without a narrative to make it sound natural. Washington's current story is elegant in its simplicity. It goes like this: America, exhausted by decades of forever wars, is prudently rebalancing its military posture. By withdrawing some troops from Europe, it can focus on the Indo-Pacific and on domestic renewal. In exchange, allies must shoulder more responsibility by spending more, buying more, and aligning more. It's sold as modernization, not abandonment. A pivot, not a retreat. In the abstract, that logic sounds reasonable, but look closer and it starts to unravel. Because what is being rebalanced isn't just military presence, it's political risk. The U.S. withdraws soldiers, but keeps contracts. It cuts public costs while expanding private gains. The risk shifts to Europe, while the revenue remains at home. This is what political theorist Antonio Gramsci once called hegemony through consent. It's not rule by force, but rule by persuasion, when the dominated internalize the worldview of the dominant and mistake dependence for cooperation. In this case, European leaders repeat American talking points so often that they begin to believe them. Partnership, they say, is the cornerstone of our freedom. Few stop to ask, whose freedom and at what price? Now, the European narrative mirrors this, but with its own twist. Brussels frames compliance as unity. The Commission insists that close alignment with Washington guarantees Europe's place in the liberal world order. Dissent, therefore, becomes dangerous. Questioning trade imbalances or troop withdrawals risks being labeled pro-Russian or anti-Western. And so, through the combined force of moral vocabulary and media repetition, a complex dependency is wrapped in virtue. Buying more American LNG becomes standing up to autocracy. Paying higher defense costs becomes protecting democracy. Even the Romanian mayor's rising bridge bill can be reframed as the cost of freedom. It's a masterclass in linguistic economics. Turn compulsion into choice, choice into duty, and duty into pride. That's how a system survives. But every narrative eventually meets reality, and reality, as always, resists spin. Consider the public mood. Across Europe, approval of U.S. global leadership is declining. Pew Research polls show double-digit drops in Germany, Spain, and even the UK. Citizens no longer accept the equation of America's interest with Europe's safety. Younger generations, those who didn't grow up under the Cold War, view the alliance less as sacred, more as transactional. For them, transatlantic unity sounds less like shared values, more like shared bills. And in that gap between rhetoric and reality, new movements emerge. Political parties from both ends of the spectrum now question the economic logic of obedience. The left critiques it as corporate exploitation. The right frames it as national humiliation. Between them, a new European realism is forming, skeptical of empire, weary of slogans, and increasingly pragmatic about power. By the way, this is precisely what Washington fears most, not anti-Americanism, but autonomy, because autonomy means unpredictability. It means contracts can be renegotiated, gas deals diversified, military purchases delayed. It means that for the first time in decades, Europe could behave as a true peer rather than a subordinate. To prevent that, both sides deploy another narrative weapon: fear. The fear of Russia, of China, of the unknown world beyond the alliance. Every new security scare becomes a reason to buy more, comply more, and ask less. The logic is circular. Dependence breeds vulnerability. Vulnerability justifies dependence. It shows how deeply political economy and psychology intertwine. When people are afraid, they accept inequality more easily, whether it's inequality between classes or between nations. Fear creates consensus. Comfort breeds doubt. That's why, even as Washington withdraws troops, it never withdraws the rhetoric of danger. It must keep the temperature high enough to make Europe feel exposed, but not hot enough to provoke rebellion. Now, imagine again our mayor in Constanza watching the evening news. The headlines report rising tensions in the Black Sea. The anchors quote U.S. analysts, warning that now is not the time to question transatlantic solidarity. He nods. Maybe they're right. Then he checks his city budget and wonders how solidarity became so expensive. That's the quiet crisis at the heart of this alliance. It's not military collapse or economic sabotage. It's the erosion of meaning. The words freedom, unity, partnership are stretched so far from their material realities that they begin to lose credibility. And once credibility is gone, no amount of spin can restore it, because sooner or later people connect the dots. They see that each policy for stability leads to higher costs and fewer guarantees. They notice that those who preach sacrifice never seem to share it. They realize that an alliance run like a business cannot sustain loyalty indefinitely. In that sense, the US-EU relationship today resembles a company more than a community, complete with shareholders, clients, and branding campaigns. But citizens don't want to be customers in democracy. They want agency. And that is precisely what this double current military retreat and commercial expansion denies them.